Conversations That Matter is a partner program of the Center for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Steve, for the opportunity.
Having you here is important to me because I am very concerned about where we're at in our relations with First Nations peoples across Canada and where we're going to get to. You know, we can take a look at some of the court cases over the, let's say, even just the last 20 years, from the Silcoteen on down through to Delgamuukw, and we see that the legal relationship is changing, but the government relationship hasn't changed. And most importantly, on the ground, for people in First Nations communities, they are living in a world that is so far removed from this. From your perspective, where are we at? And what, with the change of government, do you hope will happen to move us to the place that we need to be?
Where are we at in Canada? When I look at Canada as a whole, as a great, beautiful country, I equate it this way. It's rated 6th in terms of the United Nations Human Development Index quality of life, 6th. You apply those same indices to Indigenous peoples, we're 63rd. So it's 6th versus 63rd in terms of quality of life.
Within the same country.
Within this same beautiful, rich country called Canada.
Yeah.
And so closing this gap that exists is the big challenge for us in Canada, because this gap, this 6th versus 63rd, it represents the disproportionate number of First Nations people in jails. We're 4.5% of the population in Canada, 25-30% of the jails filled by First Nations people, both men and women, high numbers.
Yep.
It represents the high youth suicide rate amongst First Nations people. It's 4 or 5 times the national average. It represents the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, the 1,200 plus missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. It represents the 40,000 Aboriginal children in foster care. It represents the cap on education funding, the disparity in education funding. It's tuition per child on reserve is $6,500 per child. In the provincial school systems, it's $12,000 per child. In the French school systems, it's $20,000 per child. It represents that. It represents the high rates of tuberculosis and diabetes and AIDS. All these things, it represents the negative stats. So we've got to close that.
And that's not talking about healthcare services and child welfare.
So it's all related. It's the quality of life. It represents the 132 boil water advisories in our communities, you know, and the overcrowded housing. So this gap has to close. So when you ask, where are we at in Canada? It's 6th versus 63rd. So closing the gap is the challenge for everybody across this land.
And that is the word, challenge. Because if we take a look at all the reasons why there is that gap, most of them are because of policies that have been imposed upon First Nations and have put First Nations people in a position where they do not have access to opportunity, resources, and so on. Their lives have been disturbed, shattered, destroyed in the process. How do we now then start to turn that around? How do we create trust amongst communities and then start to help people, especially the youth of tomorrow, be equipped with the tools that they need to realize their full potential?
It's colonization and oppression. You know, it's genocide, you know, via 2 things.
Yep.
I always say 2 things affected First Nations people here in Canada. One was the imposition of the residential school system, which was genocide. I don't call it cultural genocide. I call it genocide. Because what else is it when you take children away from their families and their homes and their communities and their nations, you put them into a school, you know, at 5-6 years of age, and they stay in that school, and they're taught that everything good about being a First Nations person is no good. Your long hair is no good. Your languages are no good. Your customs and traditions are no good. And you're no good as an individual. And then you, on top of that, you put the sexual abuse, the physical abuse, the mental abuse. You're not healthy coming out of that system.
That's if you survive.
If you survive,
the death rate was incredibly high.
So that's one thing, and we feel the intergenerational effects of that school system, that genocidal system. We see that in our communities and our families every day. That's one thing.
Right.
And then, 1876, the Indian Act. And under that Indian Act, we couldn't leave the reserves without a permit from the Indian agent.
Right.
We weren't allowed to sell our own wheat or kill our own cattle without a permit. We weren't allowed access to a lawyer until 1951. It was illegal for an Indian to get advice from a lawyer. We weren't allowed to vote till 1961. It broke down our system of governance from hereditary chiefs and clan mothers and everything else we had into a 2-year elective system. So between the residential school system and the Indian Act, we feel it now in our communities and our territories.
Right.
So now we know that.
Yeah.
Now, moving beyond, how do we move beyond the Indian Act? How do we create hope? How do we create that there's going to be a brighter day for us in closing that gap? You know, that's the big question. And there's a couple of things. Look at what the Prime Minister has said to our chiefs in Assembly. First time ever the sitting Prime Minister has come out to address the 634 chiefs of the Assembly of First Nations. And he said, we will commit to an inquiry into missing murdered Indigenous women and girls. We will implement all the 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, calls to action. We will lift the 2% funding cap that's been in place for 20 years for First Nations chiefs and councils, which is a cap on growth, cap on population growth, cap on potential. We will lift that and establish proper fiscal arrangements with the Crown that are long-term and sustainable. We will make sure there's a good quality education for our children, you know, that's strong on math and science and literacy and numeracy, but equally strong on language and culture. And they will look at a federal law review to get all the laws of Canada that don't respect inherent rights or treaty rights in line with their own constitution, Section 35. Existing Aboriginal treaty rights are recognized and affirmed. All the laws have to be seen through that lens. So those 5 things, there's a start.
I wish we could just keep going right through, but I got to get you to take a quick little break. We'll be back in just a moment.
Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program. Thank you.
It sounds like a lot, but there's a part of me that hears it as being only a drop in the bucket because the scope of the challenge is enormous.
We got to start somewhere. There, all these good words will not mean anything, you know, unless there is major investments in federal budgets. It's a budgeting cycle that we're trying to influence. So they have a federal budget coming down. We need to see those investments in education and training, in housing, in language preservation and promotion, and dealing with the water issue, even the Child and Family Services. The Canadian Human Rights Tribunal came out with a decision. Discriminatory funding practices have been in place.
Underfunding for years.
It's discrimination. And so they have to rectify that. And this is First Nations children. And this is the most vulnerable of our society, like a wasted generation. So investments now in all those things, this gap that I talk about is going to start closing. That to me is a signal that things are going to change in this country, that we're really on the road to reconciliation.
So virtually everybody that you talk to says, okay, education plays an important component. But we just finished talking about the residential school program and how destructive and deadly it was. If I'm a First Nations family member and I've looked at what the white man's education has done to my culture, how do I embrace the concept of education moving forward? Like, how do we create that model that allows the person on Reserve or in North Winnipeg or here in downtown Eastside Vancouver?
It's this way, Stuart. We walk in both worlds as Indigenous peoples.
Yeah.
We need 2 systems of education now. And our elders constantly tell us, you got to be balanced. And it's almost like a team of horses pulling in the same direction, pulling that load. And you need math and science and literacy and all these good things. You know, we need geologists and scientists and mathematicians and business people and lawyers and doctors over here. But equally important on the other hand is your languages and your customs and your ceremonies and your traditions as a First Nations person. This grounds you. These are the 2 systems that we have to work with and have and maintain a balance going forward. That's how you get that pride back. Because remember that residential school system, it really beat the Indian out of us, our people.
Well, that was the stated objective, wasn't it?
To the point where nobody feels good about being a First Nations person again. The pride is gone, you know, to be proud of who you are and where you come from.
Right.
That's the 2 systems of education that are needed now. And Indian control of Indian education has been a theme since 1972. But we walk in both worlds, you know, strong over here, but equally strong over here. We need that balance. That's how we're going to do that.
Yeah, and I know right now the challenge is that you get young men and women coming out of the education system that happens in Reserve right at the moment, and they do not get access to the same quality of education. How do we now start to bring that quality of education, that balanced quality of education, to the local level, into real people's lives?
Basically, you influence the federal budget that's coming down.
Yeah.
That's how you do that. The Minister of Indian Affairs, Carolyn Bennett, has to make sure that she lobbies hard, and we're helping her to make sure that her departmental budget increases to make sure that she gets the resources, so that in turn filters down to our First Nations people. The Prime Minister himself said, we will remove the 2% funding cap, and we will work towards long-term sustainable fiscal relationships with First Nations people. That's the ultimate goal. Then you make those key strategic decisions and investments as First Nations governments. So it's closing that gap.
So let's take a look at opportunities that exist because of the changing legal dynamic in Canada and the ownership that is now recognized of natural resources. There are opportunities available. What role does that opportunity provide for being able to improve quality of life for First Nations? And then how do we go about making that happen so that it's happening in partnership rather than two?
That's a key word, is partnership, Stuart. That's how you do it. Before industry or federal, provincial governments try to build anything, build a relationship first. Build a really respectful, cooperative, collaborative relationship with First Nations peoples, First Nations governments. That's the first step. And include First Nations people every step of the way from start to finish on any project. In the development and design and implementation, delivery of anything, that has to happen. So include First Nations people. That's step one. Even when you look at it, you know, we keep talking about self-sufficiency and self-government, but you can't talk about that unless you start talking about economic self-sufficiency. And so they're linked. But at the same time, having said that, there are huge opportunities now for economic growth and employment growth. You know, the recent Supreme Court decision, you mentioned Chilcotin, the Williams case. That's the recent victory. We've won over 200 plus cases.
Exactly.
You know, and the sad part is that nothing changes in terms of policy and our legislation to respect and reflect and implement those rights. We can go back all these years from Dalgamuk to Siwi, Sparrow, Gurin, Williams case. The Supreme Court, not our court, but this court in Canada has said we have rights, average rights and title. Now things have to change because that creates opportunity. People want economic certainty. We want economic certainty. We want to be involved with economic growth, long-term sustainable economic development strategies, wealth creation. But that has to be responsibly balanced with the environment. Like as Indigenous peoples, we have rights, but we also have responsibilities to protect the land and water. So that's why I say, go back to the earlier point, build a relationship first. Having Indigenous peoples around decision-making boards and tables makes sense. You're going to get better decisions. And always have that balance between the economy and the environment. There's huge opportunity. And that's one of the steps going forward. Feds, province, industry, before you build anything, build a relationship with Indigenous peoples and include us.
Unfortunately, got to take another quick break. We'll be back in just a sec.
Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program. Thank you.
I can hear some people saying, but I'm worried that if I give up the control that I have right now, and then all of a sudden it's yours and it's not mine. Like, it's as though if you benefit and do well, I lose. And I don't hear that that's what you're saying.
No, we're all in this together. We're all in this together. Like when you start thinking about on an international perspective, you start talking about global warming and climate change. We're all in this. We all breathe clean air. We need clean water to survive. What are we leaving our children and grandchildren? And the point I made at this conference here, people need to start thinking, both public sector and private sector, from an Indigenous worldview perspective. And what I mean by that, when we look at things, we don't see color. We're the two-legged tribe. But we'll always acknowledge our brothers and sisters, the four-legged ones, the animals, the ones that fly, the ones that swim, the ones that crawl. We'll acknowledge that. We'll acknowledge Mother Earth, Father Sky, Grandmother Moon, Grandfather Sun. We're all connected. So when you have that Indigenous perspective, you put that into your business planning model. You know, everybody, we're all in it together. So you can't be excluded. So that's what I say to people that, oh, they're going to win and we're going to lose. No. When this gap that I continue to talk about starts closing, this is good for Canada as a country. It's not only good for First Nations people. When we start getting up to the 6th in terms of quality of life, there's a high social cost to maintaining the status quo. And that's not acceptable.
Most definitely. Poverty costs the country enormously.
That's huge. And even studies have been done. If you invest in education and training and housing and all those things, the root determinants of poverty, if you invest in Indigenous peoples, by 2025, we would add $400 billion to Canada's GDP in a positive way, and less than $200 million in social spending in GDP. Like, so it's...
We expand the pot, everybody benefits.
Exactly, that's the theme.
But we're still in this place between where we are now and where we hope to get to. And we've got obstacles in the way because we've got different trains of thought. You know, there are people who are going, oh my gosh, I'm worried about land claims and where are we at and, you know, whose land is it anyways? And I keep trying to understand, like, how did we get to this point? As I work my way through the process, you know, I had sitting where you are right now, Buffy St. Marie, who comes from the same part of Saskatchewan as you do.
Yeah, she's a relative, cousin Buffy.
And she enlightened me about the doctrine of discovery.
Yes.
And it was an eye-opener for me. I thought I knew a fair bit about where we were at and how we got here. When you read about the doctrine of discovery, and now the United Nations basically repudiating that, you met with Ban Ki-moon.
Last night, for about 5 minutes.
But he's aware of it, and the UN is aware of it. Canadians aren't. What do we need to do to enlighten them about our collective history and how we right the wrongs of the past?
Education, awareness leads to understanding, will lead to action. Educating the general Canadian public about inherent rights and treaty rights, about the residential schools, about the whole constitutional makeup of Canada is very fundamental and key. We need to start getting these things into the school systems, right? Because that's one of the requests I make to all the premiers. Change your curriculums. And every school in British Columbia, for example, should know about Aboriginal rights and title, should know about the Algamuk Supreme Court decision and the Williams case, should know about that. They should know about treaty rights. They should know about the impacts of the residential school. So start the curriculum changes now, and right from K to 12. That's one. Now, we got to do a better job of educating Canadians about the whole history of this country. Because people don't get it. Like when you talked about the doctrine of discovery, do people know what it is?
No.
The doctrine of discovery, it was declared a document from the whole Vatican in the Rome, and that's why I'm trying to make
100 AD or something like that. Yeah.
And it basically is, in simple English layman terms, it's countries of the world that are Christian and Catholic can go out to different countries of the world, plant a flag, and claim it for themselves, because the people in that land, if they're not Christians, are obviously heathen and pagan, so how could they own land and have title, you know? That's a doctrine of discovery. So how else did Canada just ask the question, how did Canada gain title to the land and resources here?
They were operating under the principles of the doctrine of discovery.
Of course, which is now being seen as an illegal and racist doctrine. And so they have no basis. So there's a term now that I use.
According to the UN, I think needs to be
repudiated.
Repudiated.
Exactly.
Yes.
And become null and void.
Yeah.
And so basically, from our perspective as Indigenous peoples, we were to share the land and resource wealth. You know, we were to share and get along. There's lots of land and resources for everyone. Why is it then that we're 63rd and everybody else is 6th? It's because of the oppression and no recognition of our lands entitled to for us as Indigenous peoples. So we've been excluded and marginalized all these years, right from even before the Royal Proclamation of 1763. The doctrine of discovery is there.
Right,
so
because the French were operating under the same concept.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And again, I do workshops on constitutional and inherent rights and treaties and everything else we want to talk about, from the doctrine of discovery right up to the Royal Proclamation, to the 1867 British North America Act, to treaties, all those things. We don't have time to get into that here, but people have to understand. That's the history of Canada. That's what it is. So it's assumed crown sovereignty, assumed crown jurisdiction, because I am trying to get an audience with Pope Francis to repudiate and repeal formally the papal bull and the doctrine of discovery. That's one of the requests. The other request is get him to formally apologize for the Catholic Church's role in the administration and delivery of the residential school system here in Canada, because that's the only church that has not done that formally. So those two things. So it's a work in progress. But again, the message to people watching this, to Canadians, is we're all in this together.
This is our final break. After these messages, we'll be back for the conclusion.
Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program. Thank you.
So,
and so it's
I can hear
sharing land and
somebody
resources.
listening and going, "Oh my gosh, okay, well, just a second. If you get that repudiated and it's the base of law, then who owns anything here? Where's ownership then? Where do we go? What does that mean for the future of Canada?" I get the sense that that you're saying we need to straighten this out, but we're all here moving forward.
Stuart, there's a principle of peaceful coexistence and mutual respect.
Mm-hmm.
That's the principles we have as Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous brothers and sisters and relatives. Peaceful coexistence and mutual respect, But we've been marginalized and put to the side for over 100+ years, right? That's not on. So it's not, we're going to take it away from you and your grandkids, and just for my grandkids. It's not that. We're to mutually benefit from sharing the land and resource wealth. And we're not doing that.
Right. I read something interesting yesterday from the Six Nations Confederacy saying that they will look at the colonial experience ultimately as a hiccup, and that they may in the future invite Canada to be part of the collective. But it's not like we're asking to be let in. We may let you in. Now, I know that you're not speaking for them, but the concept of will we get through this experience and together come out the other end
we have
stronger, better, healthier?
Stuart, we have to.
Yeah.
Canada's a great country. It's it's the best country in the world, and it's going to get better when everybody in Canada will get those principles of peaceful coexistence and mutual respect, and start embracing the idea that First Nations people have contributed a lot to this country. Look at all the land and resource wealth. Look at all their richness and their culture and their languages and everything else they've been contributing, and get rid of that misconception they have and that stereotype about Indian people being dumb, stupid, lazy, drunk, welfare, all those things. I roll my eyes. Oh, stereotype. Here we go again. We got First Nations people that are doctors and lawyers and scientists,
Engineers.
Exactly. But we walk in both worlds.
Right.
We walk in both worlds. And so as soon as Canadians start making space in their minds, hearts, and spirits, making new space and getting rid of those misconceptions, new things can come in. That's when you're going to have reconciliation. That's when you're going to have acceptance and validation that our languages are equally as important as French and English, that our ceremonies are equally as important as going to church. Our elders tell us that. There's many roads to the Creator, just get on one. The churches are over here, great stuff, get on that road. But we have a beautiful way that's equally as connected. This one is not above this one is not above this one. Once people get that, we're going to have a beautiful country.
We're starting to see it with the election of a new prime minister, his efforts moving forward. Provincial governments, I think, still have a ways to go. But the average Canadian, I think, needs to embrace the fact that we are all in this together, and that First Nations people deserve the same respect as all other Canadians.
Exactly.
And I'm hoping that it filters its way down to the average person on the street and they understand that, because I think that will be when we're finally there.
I agree totally.
When we move forward together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're all in this together. Nobody's going anywhere. So the peaceful coexistence and mutual respect.
Thank you very much.